Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Tamara Tolles-O'Laughlin, and I'm the Executive Director of the Maryland Environmental Health Network. We are a small operation. On the screen, you'll see our Program Manager, Yinka Bade George, who is the facilitator of the Environmental Justice Legislative Team during session. We meet on Monday afternoons to check in, to follow the proximity of bills, and to share all the news that's worth printing. The Environmental Justice Legislative Team is a group of advocates and some activists that work together to magnify community voices by way of the legislative process so that we can deal with environmental inequities in the state of Maryland. We are open as a team and are happy to welcome new members to participate in this process as we are actively trying to encourage connectivity between community members and decision makers. The founding members of the Environmental Justice Legislative Team include Blue Water Baltimore, the Beloved Community Church of Accokeek, Maryland, Chesapeake Physicians for Social Responsibility, Interfaith Partners for the Chesapeake, the Maryland chapter of the Sierra Club, Maryland League of Conservation Voters, and Chispa, Maryland. The co-chairs of the legislative team are the Maryland Environmental Health Network and Clean Water Action. Together, we spend a lot of time trying to coordinate meaningful conversations between our constituent groups so that the vehicles that get proposed match the problems. At the Maryland Environmental Health Network, we have a very specific vision for what the future looks like. It's one that's more integrated, where we are speaking to environmental threats from the perspective of people that are most harmed. We care deeply about vulnerable population health, and we are hoping for a future where your health is not determined by your status, income, education, occupation, gender, race, or zip code. We spend a lot of time working in coalition with others to level the playing field for vulnerable populations and hope that by joining, you are also interested in the same. Our partner for today's meeting is Waterkeepers Chesapeake. It's a coalition of 19 independent programs working to make the waters of the Chesapeake and the coastal bays swimmable and fishable. By way of the Waterkeeper Betsy Nicholas, we are working with Maya Van Rossum of the Delaware Waterkeepers for specific information on the proliferation of green amendments and what it will take to get one done in Maryland. So thanks so much to Waterkeepers Chesapeake as a trusted partner and friend. Our lens as a public health organization is one that looks at population level. To say it plainly, we are looking at the population health impacts for all of us. So we take into consideration specific settings, locations, outcomes as we see them, and we are concerned about the ways that the health sector is either easier or harder to reach for those who are insulated or excommunicated from society and culture, those who do or don't have access to means and capital, and how that impacts overall health. Our goals are simple. We want to make it so people are less likely to be sick and less likely to die untimely deaths because they have a positive capacity to meaningfully make up their own minds. They are active parts of the decision-making process. For us, community resiliency is in direct correlation to agency, and that means communities have to have the ability to speak to them for themselves about what they're experiencing. The issues that brought us to the Maryland Green Amendment and a conversation about it are increasing rates of cancer in the state of Maryland. We work with communities who live in close proximity to industrial activities, who experience noise, light, air, and water pollution impacts on health, and who are in the middle of the rise of fossil fuel infrastructure and are specifically interested in natural gas infrastructure impacts on their health. We work with these communities to help them develop a voice, to work with agencies so that they are not just living in the footprint, but have the decision-making power to impact their own health. The issues that we hear that bubble up from the communities that work with us in our network are a loss. It's a cachet of losses and damages. They lose the community, they lose the safety of community, they lose social cohesion or the ability to act as members of community. They fail to see their experiences mirrored in local and environmental health agencies who do not necessarily respond to their concerns. And there's a dearth of local data to prove the harms that they're experiencing. So that brought us to the Maryland Green Amendment. What is it? For us, it's a constitutional right to uncontaminated water, breathable air, and a healthy environment for present and future generations of all Marylanders. We want people to have healthy and healthful lives and to have access to a future that is as promising as the one that was passed down to them. We're looking for an amendment that will speak to the interest, our interest in a non-toxic environment, or else provide a right for community members to individually challenge the lack of a healthy environment in the court of law. We're looking for this right to be embedded within the state constitution, but we will speak to that a little bit later in our program. Since this is our very first briefing, we are experimenting with our content. The first third should be our discussion on a public health lens. We'll ask for some voices who are out in the webinar universe to tell us what they're experiencing and why this matters to them. And we'll conclude with a more specific analysis of what the Maryland Green Amendment is and what we hope it would be should we get a proposal. We have our community expert, Nina Beth Cardin, Rabbi Cardin. Are you on the line? Let's see if we can hear from her. Give us just a moment. Rabbi Cardin, are you on the line? Okay, while we wait for her to join us, we'll talk a little bit about community concerns that we have heard from the folks that we work with more specifically, and the lessons that we're learning from the 35 other states that have advanced some form of Green Amendment. To date, there are 20 active Green Amendments, only 2 of which bring in the power of the court to be able to advance protections for individuals who have been violated or had their health impacted. Pennsylvania communities and Montana communities have worked really hard to have something that isn't just ornamental. And what they have is a right to action when their health is impacted. Folks in Pennsylvania, in the process of getting their legislation, have been very clear about what it is they were up against. The statements on the screen point to you about a powerful advantage that business interests have, how they have access to science and to political voice and to dollars to be able to make their case, to work against communities who struggle with each. Communities have also pointed out that they face lawsuits where they are outmaneuvered by business interests that can use property rights and other widely known constitutional liberties to justify environmental degradation. That ultimately means that we need to fight fire with fire. If environmental degradation can be bound up within a lattice work of regulation and laws, we should have some rights on an equal playing field for communities to be able to respond to those threats. I'll pause for a moment before we move into emerging policy and legislative proposals. Rabbi Cardin, are you available?
Hi there. I am actually in a public place where you might hear noise behind me, but I am with you guys. Yeah.
Would you like to speak to some of your interest in a Maryland-based proposal for a Green Amendment and why you thought it was important to push for it now?
Thank you. Let me take a few minutes to do that. The purpose of this amendment would be to place in the Constitution of the State of Maryland, in the Declaration of Rights, which is our Bill of Rights, and if this is repeated, then just tell me to move on. The understanding that we have a right, we the people have a right to a healthy environment, and that right is on par with all the other civil rights that we have, which is freedom, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech. And this puts constraints, this constitutional amendment would put constraints on the government. So some of the things, I just got on tomorrow, so I didn't hear everything you said, but some of the powers that now rest in government and that government can provide to businesses would be constrained by this constitutional amendment. This amendment would override inconsistencies in the rules and regulations that now are out there. The government right now can be given the authority to do all sorts of things to regulate and monitor the environment. So it is the final rule for what is appropriate. There is no backstop to say to the government, you can't do that right now. This amendment would say to the government, you are in fact under the aegis of this constitutional amendment, which gives the people the rights to this healthy and healthful environment. So it's a wonderful backstop to constrain the government and then prevent the government from doing or not doing things that would protect us. Another reason why we need this is because, especially now in the federal level and potentially also what we're seeing in the state level, gains that we had in the past can be upended and reversed from administration to administration, executive order to executive order. This would be an enduring contribution to our Constitution, and unless there were a constitutional amendment to upend this amendment, this would be the law of the land. Plus, we know in our gut that we believe in the freedom of speech. We believe in the freedom of assembly. If we have a constitutional amendment that says that we have a right to a healthy and healthful environment, it's something we believe in our gut. It is something that we expect. We don't expect to have to fight for it. We expect for the government to protect this. And we know that this is there for something that is just part of the DNA of an American privilege and an American right that we can fight for and have a right to expect protection of the environment. I can keep going, but Tamara, if you want to jump in.
No, well, actually, I wanted to ask you, why now?
Well, I said one of the things why now is because the federal government is appallingly stripping the benefits that we had on the federal level to the protection of the environment. On a state level, we also are not seeing the kinds of advancements that we would like to see. We're still fighting about coal-fired power plants. We're still fighting about liquid nitrogen gas and the gas export. We're still fighting about the coal trains. We're still fighting about the appropriate level of lead. We're still in our water and in the air. We're still fighting about what we can expect from our government and governmental protections. And it, in a sense, it's not just why now. It's why haven't we done it up until now? But finally, I think we're finally realizing that the permitting processes, the federal regulations, excuse me, the state regulations are just not getting us there. And instead, what we have is a system which permits certain levels of pollution and regulation, and it is us, the people, who have to fight the right of the corporations to pollute. It's got to be flipped on the other side. It's got to be that we have a right to unimpeded, pure air, water, environment. And if the corporations of the state want to do anything against us, they're going to have the burden of proof to say why that is a necessary public good to pollute. So if not now, I guess the short answer is it should have been done before, and if not now, when?
Well, I'd like to also ask you, in your professional experience and your life as a Marylander, where are you seeing communities that could especially benefit from having this kind of backstop, or communities who haven't been served by the current lattice work of federal regulations, even in their strongest position?
Well, one of the things that I'm hoping we can do in this call, and this will be an ongoing conversation, is to hear from organizations and individuals themselves as to how they imagine their frustrations can be answered by this amendment. But, for example, Cove Point, I believe that we had a constitutional amendment. Cove Point would be much stronger.
Rabbi Cardin?
I think the issue first, any assault on public lands which belong to the people, or public access lands, would be protected by this amendment. And anything that would be done to affect that would have to be run through the lens of this amendment to see if, in fact, that action was in keeping with or violated this amendment. So there would have to be, ideally, by the way, there would also have to be not only an environmental impact statement that said, no, this act does not violate that amendment, but there would also have to be a health impact statement to make sure that whatever was done to this environment did not harm human health too. So I think it could be very beneficial. But as I say, I'd love to hear from people in the organizations and individuals to tell me how they think this could help them.
Fantastic. And I'll ask you one final question. Is there a specific role for faith communities in advancing this overall goal? Because it seems so simple, but it's really complicated when you try to roll it out. So is there a specific role for faith communities in helping articulate some of this?
That is certainly a softball question to a person like me, like a rabbi, right? I think, I thank you so much for that. I think faith communities have an absolute leadership role to take, and the Central Maryland Ecumenical Council is, and I know you spoke before them, their Green Advisory Group, is looking to see how it can participate. But in a faith language, we would say that creation is a gift from God, that we don't own it, that we are here to benefit from it and to steward it. Genesis 1 says that the humans were put in the Garden of Eden to tend it and to protect it. So we know that we have to live in partnership with the earth so that we can have all the gracious dignity of civilization that we have, but we also have to do it in a way that sustains it and protects it. So from a faith perspective, it is part of our sacred story in the Western world, Christian, Judaic, sacred story, that this is something that we have to do, and it is our responsibility as partners with God to take care of God's creation. So yeah, from the faith perspective, it is exactly what we're called to do.
Fantastic. I will open up. Thank you so much for joining the conversation. I'll open up the line so that we can hear from others and see if we can generate a little more discussion. Betsy, are you on the line?
I am, but I'm easy.
Okay. The question of this window is, why do we need a green amendment in the state of Maryland?
Yeah, well, lots and lots of reasons, but I would say the biggest and most important is because we really have nothing to give us standing in a lot of different issues, and this would provide that right for citizens to stand up to protect their public health. In a lot of circumstances where we have things like pipelines going in on people's property, the system for challenging that under things like the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, you really can't stop any of these projects. All you can do is get additional reviews and slow it down. But adding a public health component into this, or looking at people's rights of air and water at that very basic level, and having that be part of the consideration before big infrastructure proposals like that are granted, really takes this to a different level and is really important for considering how these things move forward. And we don't have anything that does that for us in law right now. So I think that that would be really important and helpful for moving these conversations forward and getting a different perspective on who is relevant in the decision-making policy, that it's not just the economics of putting in this new infrastructure or pipeline or incinerator or anything like that, but it should also be taking into account the rights of the citizens who live in and around those areas.
Thank you, Beth. As we haven't quite gotten to it yet, but in the universe of green amendments that exist, there are two categories. There are some green amendments that are ornamental and some that provide a right. Could you tease out the difference between the two of those for folks who are joining us today?
Sure. So we've all seen the ornamental kind of laws and statutes before where, and in fact, I was thinking about doing one this year on Conowingo, but basically where the state or the whatever parties say, this is a big priority. We care about air and land and water and take those things into consideration, and that's always something that we're going to think about. So it's great. It's this lofty idea, and it's certainly better than nothing, but there isn't anything actionable in it. You can't bring a lawsuit to hold somebody accountable for not paying enough weight or consideration to something when it's just sort of a lofty goal. What we're really hoping for is something that's more substantive, that has parts of it that we can tie back to actual actions and decision-making processes, so that we can bring legal action or base regulatory changes or regulatory structures based on rights that are actually preserved in the law. And that's what we want to show, is that it's not just the rights of corporations to pollute under a system that allows permits for them to pollute. There's also rights for citizens to have clean air, clean water, that we have those rights as well. And that when they're being violated, there's something that we can do about it. So that's what we're really trying to look at, not just that it's sort of a goal to have these clean and healthy environments for us, but that there's actually protection built in.
And Betsy, is there an imminent threat in your wheelhouse of water protection that would be especially served by a green amendment?
Yeah, I feel like water gets forgotten a lot of the time, but in our news feed in the past week, just looking at what's happened with Pennsylvania and the oil gas pipeline that failed the week that it was commissioned and started running. In Massachusetts, we have these high pressure incidents causing massive fires and blowouts, and we don't exactly know what's causing that. That also gets into our waterways as well. And not to mention that what we have going on with the hurricane and the tremendous water pollution that comes about as a result of that. Just one example in that would be, well, actually this is two, the coal ash ponds or the hog waste ponds. But when they overflow and are contaminating everybody's groundwater supplies for perhaps decades to come, it's not the person who operated it, it's not the coal ash operator or the hog farm operator who ends up having to suffer those consequences. It's the homeowner who's drinking contaminated water. And right now there's no outlets for dealing with those problems. So trying to get at something that protects those fundamental rights is very important.
And are there any, is this an opportune time for Maryland to take on a green amendment, in your opinion? You don't have to speak for the whole state, but just in your opinion.
Well, I think there's a lot of frustration in Maryland about what's happening at the federal level, that Maryland does take pride in protecting its citizens and its environment. And so I think that actually, in this case, rare to think about our federal government failure being an opportunity. But in this weird instance, it actually works that way a little bit, because it gives the state an opportunity to step up and provide additional protections beyond just what's happening at the federal. And there's also a good coming together of the community on working on a lot of different issues like this and having some success at pulling together. We've got pretty good, amongst the various groups, we've got pretty good communications with our constituencies, pretty good grassroots capabilities. So I think it's definitely a good time. I don't know if you can ever pick what's the best time, but I think it gives us a good opportunity to step out and say Maryland's going to do better.
Fantastic. I'm going to see, just stand by. I'm going to see if there are other folks who want to join our conversation. But thank you so much, Betsy. One moment, please.
Sure.
Everyone on the call, you'll notice that your ability to speak has been, you've been unmuted. So if you would like to speak, now's a really good time for us to have a little bit of conversation about a Green Amendment and what it's doing in the places where they exist and what it could do in Maryland before we dive into a specific conversation about what a proposal or a bill would look like in the state of Maryland. So feel free to ask any questions or share your thoughts.
Betsy, did you just say this? What is the chance of a bill in this session?
I didn't say that. So are you asking, what do you think the chance of it getting put forward or passing, or both?
Both.
I think that I think we have a strong, internally, there's been some look at language, and we'll get into that. Tomorrow, I think, is going to get into that next. So I think that there's very strong potential for putting forward a bill. I think that there's the background research has been done and looked at of how to structure it and how to write it to be the most effective. There's also leadership who wants to take it on, which is so important. Factors like that are in place. The next part is, the really important one of passing it. And that really, I think that's what we're doing right now, is looking at the appetite and the engagement in the community. And if those pieces are all there, then it can go forward. I mean, I don't want to sound too Pollyanna about it. A lot of times it takes a couple of years to push things forward, but sometimes when you just get the right synergies, you can flip the switch and move everyone forward at the same time and get something done in 1 year.
And I'll add to that, Ruth, by saying that Betsy's correct. There are leaders in the legislature who are excited about this idea. Folks who, for the reasons she's laid out, are deeply interested in figuring out what it would look like to unify all the problems we're trying to stop here and trying to stop there, as opposed to having some wholesale response. I also think, as we all look at the context of the federal government offering us less opportunities to protect our health and the environment, there's more interest in figuring out what Maryland could do specifically to protect what's happening within its own borders. So if we can no longer rely on this incredible lattice work of environmental laws that rival any on the planet, but if they don't exist, or they are rendered moot, or the underpinnings and regulations that support them are unavailable, there are things that can be done at the state level. And we have the opportunity of a very large swath of the General Assembly turning over, and that usually tends to suggest that folks who are motivated to make things happen want to see things happen immediately. So of all the times where we could propose this, there are always different circumstances, but for all intents and purposes, there is a hunger and a leadership. There is a hunger for folks who are working on lots of different pieces of this work for us to do something that's unifying. And ultimately, we have a crisis/impetus to get this done in short order, because climate change, we're already late to respond to it. And in order for this to be successful, we have to have an incredible year of discussion in 2019, and we're going to have an even better year for for a voter turnout during a general election, because that's what's required to move something from an idea into a constitutional amendment. But I'll get into that in a little bit. But I want to give you the chance to ask any more other questions or just comment on what you're thinking around this or what you're hearing in Howard County.
Well, I'm interested to know which legislators have expressed interest already.
I think it's important to because of the movement in the legislature and because of the fact that there are going to be people moving around into different positions as they're staffing, moving the new folks into their boards. We're probably just a little premature for that, but we've had a lot of great conversations together and as individuals talking to our environmental partners and a lot of new legislators who have to be installed about this. So I do think we're probably a month or so out from saying that publicly, but we're pretty confident.
Actually, yes, and Tamar, let me add to that too, as what you guys are saying, both you and Betsy are great. But I also believe that there is a great frustration now on the part of legislators, as well as I think on the part of the public, that we have to attend to the environmental degradation that we're facing piecemeal. Right? This piece of legislation, that piece of aggression, that piece of offense, that piece of protection. And there is a hunger that is growing to say we need this overarching philosophical legal umbrella, sort of an umbrella and a backstop. So both of those metaphors that can help us understand who we are as a people, who we are as a state, and the kind of structural defense we can provide ourselves and the environment.
Nina, can you hear us? Nina? Nina, can you hear us? Oh, I guess we may have lost her. Hold on one moment there. We're getting a question. Nina, can you hear us? Okay. In the meantime, we've got a question from Elizabeth. Air and water are fluid. What about the same types of protection against contamination of soils for future generations? Does anybody on the call want to jump in on that?
Protection for the soil?
Yes.
That is absolutely part of this.
Hi, Barbara. How are you? I'm Emma here, and I'm thinking of buying a ticket for my first new movie.
Okay, sorry about that. Go on, Nina.
I'd like to hear a little bit more about the question, because
Sure.
Soil is absolutely a part of the protection that we want to provide. Tell us more about the question.
Sure. The question just said, will there be the same type of protections under a green amendment for contamination of soil for future generations? And I can start off by saying that this bill is all about the idea that we have to be looking in the future. We have to be thinking about the future. We have to preserve something for future generations, because the bill proposal itself wouldn't just ask for health now, but for a guarantee that there is a right to litigate the protection of the land, the water, and the people in the future. And so it is a specifically future-facing proposal that looks at our responsibility now to create some space for future generations to make decisions that promote their own health and happiness. But Nina, do you want to, yeah, the question specifically was, if air and water are fluid, what about the same type of protection against contamination of soils for future generation? I think that's a fairly big umbrella, but it is in contemplation. You want to elaborate on that?
Well, yeah, I just want to say, actually, the soil is the easiest because you can draw a boundary around the soil in the state of Maryland. That soil is pretty much, we would be talking about the soil in the state of Maryland. Air and water, obviously, is much, and you're right, is much more fluid, and that gets a little bit more difficult to put boundaries around and say, how do we control that? But it is possible to do that as well. So soil is absolutely in there. It is air, land, water, all those three. But again, whoever asked it, if there's a specific concern about the soil that you're thinking of, I would love to hear it so we could explore that a little more.
Yeah, we spent a lot of time in preparing for thinking about this proposal, contemplating the harm. We have thought about air quality and not just the ways it shows up when we cut down an old forest, but we've also thought about what it means to air quality for communities that are plagued by truck traffic, that are plagued by living so close to the port that they might as well be on a boat for all intents and purposes. We thought about what it means to women who are expecting children and who have air quality, water quality, noise pollution issues. We have definitely thought about the contamination of the soil and the failure in large extent to protect people from brownfield pollution. I can say without a shadow of a doubt, brownfields and the idea that the ground can be poisoned by an industrial actor with no real responsibility unless that person is caught, that industry is caught in the act, or if another industry wants to develop it, like real estate. So essentially trying to create a catch-all for all the things that happen between one industrial use and another, and a development and of people's lives in the space between those two events. Soil is a huge part of it because it is a transfer vehicle. It's a carbon sink for climate. It helps us mitigate the very worst impacts of climate, and it isn't just with the trees, it's the soil itself. So I think that there's a lot to be said around the implications for a green amendment that allows us to think about the future and the regenerative power of soil. Any other questions from folks who are, you should check, you're probably unmuted, so feel free to jump in if you have something you'd like to say.
By the way, Tamara, just what they're thinking, yes, as we really want to put in the language of this amendment, the very phrase for future generations as well. So this is not just something that would be assumed or has to be argued, but that it would be in the amendment itself. So it absolutely says the state is the trustee for resources of the state amongst all the people, and that means they're therefore responsible for future generations as well as today.
Fantastic. Any other thoughts or comments before we move back into the formal presentation on what a Maryland amendment might look like, and then we'll open back up to questions. As Nina mentioned, this is just the first of many conversations we want to advance as we're trying to develop the shape, the language, and the trajectory for a successful Maryland Green Amendment. What I will do is move into the proposals section so we can talk about some of the successful attributes of a Green Amendment, and then we'll open it back up for questions after that. But thanks so much to Betsy, Nina, and Ruth Alice White for jumping in to start off our discussion. Let's discuss energy policy and legislative models. So to date, Pennsylvania and Montana have the strongest green amendments. That's many states have tried, only a few have been successful, and as Betsy and I discussed earlier, they have been the ones that have not been successful have largely been ornamental. They've stated really high and lofty goals about what it means to have clean air, but not defined who might help it to be the case and who would be responsible for regulating it if there was a failure. One of the most successful has been our neighbors in Pennsylvania. While they were unable to have a moratorium on fracking or a ban on fracking that where Maryland has been successful, they have in fact succeeded in protecting themselves from the web of natural gas infrastructure by virtue of their Green Amendment. Their Green Amendment was established in 1971, and the language should be on the screen before you. But for those on the phone, it says, people have a right to a clean air, pure water, and to preservation of the natural, scenic, historic, and aesthetic values of the environment. Pennsylvania's public and natural resources are the common property of all the people, including generations yet to come. And as a trustee of these resources, the Commonwealth shall conserve and maintain them for the benefit of all the people. So to refer back to the question that we just got about soil, it isn't specifically listed there, but there has been some pretty significant policy shifts between when the legislation became law in 1971 and its 2013 responses to natural gas infrastructure. So the people's right to a healthy environment was established there in 71, and it was more of a statement of policy than a statement of law until December 2013. The Supreme Court declared that a fundamental provision of the act was unconstitutional, along with Act 13, which was a giveaway. It allowed oil and gas to preempt local zoning and was incredibly pro-drilling in response to fracking opportunities. And even without a ban, there have been successes in defining what protection of the health of people based on this Green Amendment. If we are able, I think in about 20 minutes, we'll probably be joined, a little less than 20 minutes, we'll probably be joined by the Delaware Riverkeeper, who can talk to you a bit from her experience about what it meant to turn over the most nefarious parts of this act and to bring up what a Green Amendment would mean, such that a court could provide it the status of a real right and not just a lofty goal. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court was specifically important in 2016, was able to work against a medical gag rule, which as the Maryland Environmental Health Network were particularly sensitive to, because the idea that medical professionals will be gagged from being able to speak about the impacts of fossil fuel infrastructure and natural gas infrastructure as a root cause of people's health conditions means you are relegated to referring to treating people for their symptoms and never really getting to what's harming them. So having a medical gag rule specifically limits the ability of communities who are suffering from ever putting a name to what they know is happening to them. And in our experience, that causes a double layer of trauma, increases the likelihood for a lack of wellness, and increases your mortality rate as a result of losing agency, losing your wealth, and losing your self-determination, on top of actually being made sick because the air, the water, and the soil are contaminated. Pennsylvania's Justice Christine Donahue said specifically that the Commonwealth may not approach our public and natural resources as a proprietor, and instead must give at all times into its role as a trustee. Because the legislative enactments at issue here do not reflect that the Commonwealth complied with its duty, the order of the court is with respect to constitutionality is reversed. Ultimately, the court said that you can't just manage these, you can't just be a manager, you have to be a steward. And ultimately what we would be looking for in Maryland is a similar right to be able to actively and with a forward-thinking approach, protect the future of Maryland. And so acting as a trustee is by very nature focusing on the future, because a trustee acts in advance of a future that is yet to come. And if we're commanding that the folks who will be around, the government entities that will be around, treat the resources, the people, and the land, the water, and the air in this way, then we are vesting in them our hopes in the future, whether or not we're here to see it. Montana had similar success and a slightly different piece of legislation. Their legislation came after a series of successive attempts to shape the state's environmental agenda, and was specifically developed around responses to mining operations. Local communities got together and built their momentum towards a Green Amendment. And one of the non-governmental organizations that was a prime sponsor of that legislation, pardon me, was Women's Voices for the Earth, based out of Missoula, Montana. They are specifically focused on the health impacts of environmental issues and on the toll that we take personally when we're exposed to chemicals and toxics without our knowledge, and as they form the picture of our health, because those exposures are stacked across our entire lives. So Montana was able to be successful by focusing on that momentum and continually building towards this model. The justice in the case that gave Montana its Green Amendment says specifically the Constitution does not require that dead fish float on the surface of our state's rivers and streams before its far-sighted environmental protections can be invoked, making it an anticipatory and preventative constitution. So what we're looking for in Maryland is going to have a similar thrust. It will have to be something that isn't just responsive to the thing that is bothering us today or the health concerns we've had over the course of our development, but what are we doing? Do we have to wait until we've lost everything worth saving before we fight for it? And our answer is no. So what would it look like for Maryland to have a Green Amendment? I would argue, as the leader of this network and as a partner to everyone on this call, that our constitutional amendment would be a natural successor to all the work we've done in fracking. Whereas there are really valid and important proposals that will likely show up in the legislature this year around community science, around the end of fossil fuels and when we will have a date for that, around protection of water and air quality, around health impact assessments. All of these are things that are to come in the legislature in 2019, but guess what? Each one of those focuses on a piece rather than the entire puzzle of what is going wrong in our environment in Maryland and what we're looking at in terms of our trajectory of what could go wrong. So if we got together and made such an argument to stop natural gas infrastructure, only to find that there's still so much work to do to keep out the lattice work, or as the Delaware Riverkeeper described it, the web of natural gas infrastructure that has infiltrated our state despite the ban, it was really important to think about what's the next move. Is it to fight for transportation, which affects climate? Yes. Is it to fight natural gas infrastructure and compressor stations destroying our communities' air quality and water and our ways of life? Yes. Is it about protecting ourselves from the air quality threats that ruin people's health permanently? Yes. But what's the best way to do that is to look at a comprehensive solution in addition to all of these root cause solution, in addition to all these symptoms that we're fighting. So Maryland's policy would inevitably be a prophylactic protection of our right to health in the future. So it's not just waiting to be enacted, it will be looking forward. If we were to get a Green Amendment, it would strengthen the environmental law we already have on the books. For as long as we have it under this administration, we currently have a Clean Water Act, a Safe Drinking Water Act, a Clean Air Act. We have CERCLA, aka Superfund, and we have the Toxic Substances and Control Act, each of which to varying degrees has managed to deal with some aspect of environmental pollution and degradation, and in some instances has dealt with with human health impacts. Any and everybody on this call can probably point out to you that there are holes the size of states between what is happening and what is not happening between these bills and the regulations that have come as a result of them. But it is important to note that having a backstop, as Nina mentioned, would be an incredible way for us to determine that whatever gaps exist, we don't want to have our human health impacted. And in the event where we lose federal protections, Maryland would not be left naked and afraid trying to figure out how to protect our natural resources and our human health. So Maryland's Green Amendment could act as a backstop for future legislation. All of the proposals that I mentioned previously are things that have yet to be. But what would it look like if the worst thing that could happen if we did or did not get a bill on transportation would be that we would still have a backstop for a basic right to a healthy and healthful environment? We would then, as our fight for transportation would take on an entirely different tenor, because we wouldn't have to continually prove that we have a right that's vested in our Constitution to protect ourselves from the pollution that comes from transportation. We wouldn't have to argue that soil contamination and brownfields, whether or not they get turned into all the solar fields we could ever imagine, we cannot fail to discuss the fact that human health is impacted by what's happening, and we need to be able to have some form of insurance as we look toward the future. For Maryland specifically, we need to be proactive in protecting our right to health in the future, and the Green Amendment could protect against the gaps between every permit, regulation, and every agency that is tasked for human and health to protect us from human and health threats. and I'm specifically talking about Maryland Department of Environment, the Department of Health, Department of Natural Resources. Each of these represent an opportunity for us to do this work, but there are a lot of gaps between the way they work together, and having an amendment could fill those gaps. A Maryland Green Amendment would be really specifically advantageous to groups of Marylanders, subsistence anglers and fishers and hunters, and commercial fishermen and hunters, chemically sensitive children, adults experiencing late onset allergies, communities living in the footprint of unwanted industrial operations, communities living near freight train operations, bus depots, cargo ships. It could protect the old growth forests that we're working so hard to protect in the legislature. It could protect our coastal wetlands. It will ultimately protect our water supply and all the home values that are associated with having potable water or not having access to it. A green amendment will be proactive in all of those spaces for all of those groups. It would also protect against policies that work against the precautionary principle. In the 2018 session, those two words came up a lot, the precautionary principle. Not just explaining what they meant, but thinking a lot about what it means to have to constantly make a burden of proof that you are being harmed when you know it to be true, such that it can pass scrutiny, because in this country, we do not accept that if we think it's doing harm, we should wait until we can prove that it's safe. This Green Amendment would also protect impacted communities and keep them from having to constantly play defense and whack-a-mole, as we say in natural gas infrastructure, trying to fight this pipeline versus that pipeline. It would provide a basic set of protections to keep us from doing all of that work every time, starting from scratch. A Green Amendment could also protect against violations of state mandates and missions to protect human health in all the agencies I mentioned. In specifics, it could protect us against landfill construction, maintenance, or malfeasance. There are so many leaks in landfill construction that and just the previous manner in which we designed landfills, that there are a ridiculous number of health protections that we have to try to find out where those harms are located in law to fight them individually instead of having a wholesale response. Toxic waste dumping and exposure, air pollution, and all the ways it shows up in children and in adults and in the different illnesses that we have. It could act as a protector for climate change catalysts, including methane, volatile organic compounds, all of which are, as we increase natural gas infrastructure in a state, become more human health threat. It would go very far to helping us get to swimmable and fishable waters and protect the food chain, which is actively being poisoned. So in thinking about what a Maryland policy would actually look like, we are clear that a Green Amendment must call for state protection for the right to uncontaminated water, breathable air, and a healthy environment. And that has to focus on present and future generations. The state must have these rights in trust as stewards and be forced to conserve and maintain the benefits in perpetuity for individuals who can enforce this in the court of law. So that's not our proposed language, but that's the what has to be in it in order for it to be valid, for it to be useful, and for it to be enforceable. So there are 4 things that we would need to do when we get off this call as partners in trying to advance this policy in the state of Maryland. We need to mobilize, articulate, motivate, and activate. I have yet to take up the fact that there are a lot of ways to think about the way we could move forward. But in Maryland, we need to mobilize residents, the folks on this call and everyone you know and all the communities you represent. We need to galvanize a push for a Green Amendment this year in 2019. And we want that right to be located in our Declaration of Rights so that it's co-equal with freedom of speech and freedom of assembly, as mentioned by the folks on this call earlier. In terms of articulating, we must be very clear in the ways that we just discussed around looking for state protections, making sure the state is a trustee, and creating enforceability. And we have to make sure the bill that passes has every single element of this in order for it to move to a place where it's useful when it moves into a referendum. We have to motivate the General Assembly and all the members of the legislature in a simple majority to vote so that we can change the Constitution. That's the first hurdle. So for 2019, that's our goal. 2020 is a referendum. Activate. Residents must vote directly on the right to health and environment during a general election. If we miss the boat on this by 2020, we will be stuck waiting until 2024. And that universe is a very scary one for me personally. So I'm excited about the idea that we're taking this time to make this happen. And I will stop here and open it up for questions and answers if we have any, before we expect a brief set of comments from the Delaware Riverkeeper, who will join us shortly. But any questions on what we've talked about? We gave a little bit more specificity around the bill proposal and what it might look like. So any questions or thoughts around that? And you should find yourself unmuted.
Tamara, while others are thinking, this is Nina, one of the things I wanted to point out was that in Pennsylvania, the Supreme Court found that those last words of the Pennsylvania's Constitutional Amendment for a Green, Healthy Environment, that is for all, those words for all, were meant to promote environmental equity and environmental justice. And the Supreme Court, in fact, has ruled in one or two cases that if there is an inequitable assessment of how to handle pollution and degradation, and if it overburdens one segment of the society, then that is unconstitutional. So having those words in there too, so that would be for all, would help protect that equity component that we all desperately want to include and protect.
This is Betsy. Nina, I think you make a really important point with that. And right now it's a very difficult situation to address with a lot of our regulatory schemes. For example, pollution trading is something that has a lot of concerns coming up with environmental justice and how the allocations could move around, that unfortunately pollution tends to flow towards poverty. So having some, again, another backstop to prevent that, because a lot of the trading proposals go outside of our normal statutory system and don't really have the kinds of checks and balances on them that we would otherwise have. So having something else out there to say you can't just move all the pollution to certain communities, I think it's really important and helpful.
Hi everyone, can you hear me?
Yes.
So I was wondering what, if any, are the opportunities in taking a more localized approach to the Green Amendment. As we're talking, I was thinking about the styrofoam ban and how there was like more Baltimore City, there was like a Baltimore City proposed styrofoam ban in conjunction to the state level one. Do you think that there are opportunities in taking similar approaches to the Green Amendment and taking a statewide approach in conjunction with more local initiatives? This is open to anyone.
Thanks for the question, Yinka. I think what she's speaking to specifically is the idea is how do we build the grassroots force that is going to respond, because we're not going to just get an amendment passed if we're only talking about this in Annapolis. Any thoughts?
Again, hopefully others will jump in. This is Nina. One of the things that I do want to say is, and for the lawyers in the group like Tamara, and I don't know, Betsy, are you a lawyer too? I'm not quite sure.
Yeah.
For the lawyers in the group, you'll be able to either confirm or correct it. Usually, the court system prefers not to use constitutional regulations to affirm or deny law. They prefer to use something much more local, much more granular. So in fact, these are two sides of the same coin. We want to go after a state constitutional amendment to provide that backstop and that umbrella and to provide a cohesive vision of what the values are toward people's rights toward a happy environment. But at the same time, we should have as many local laws that address local issues as possible, because they're much easier to win, I'm understanding, in a court of law. So that we need both. Would you guys agree?
Yeah, I think we're gonna, in order to get a referendum passed, we're gonna need everybody, which means we're gonna have to talk to everybody. and one way that local communities have weighed in is by passing an ordinance that suggests that they're in support of a statewide initiative. Betsy, you want to weigh in on that? But it's been really effective in the air quality space. If we are finding there's some gridlock, local municipality can weigh in, and that's been really helpful in pushing the needle on letting on making it clear that this is a priority.
Yeah, that was very important in certainly our fracking battles and work on that, and it's worked in a lot of other places. I think ideally the way this would unfold is that we proceed with something at the state level, but ask local governments to do those "we are in support of this" sort of actions as a good organizing, get in the community tool. But then the next step would be what Nina Beth was talking about, of once you have this base umbrella of protection at the state level, then ideally you're going to be building upon that in your local governments, in your zoning, in your planning documents, because you have this layer of protection. So hopefully it's going to leave this broader netting of regulations, policies, other laws built in at the local level, all based off of that state level authorization.
Maya, are you on the line?
Yes, hi. I'm sorry, I've been on for a while, but I couldn't find the code that let me speak. So I've now done that. And hear that you have been all engaged for quite a while with some things I agree with and some things I disagree with. So I'm not sure how you would want me to jump in at this point, but happy to just sit tight and answer any questions.
No, we're happy to hear from you. So can you talk to us about your experience pushing for national legislation, pushing for Delaware to have this right, and what it would mean for the state of Maryland based on how all of this works in real life, which is not in such a segmented way?
Yeah. So, in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, there was what I call the Green Amendment, right? And this is a constitutional provision with inalienable rights language that's located in the Bill of Rights section of the Constitution. It's important to note there are a lot of states that talk about the environment in their constitutions, but they do not rise to the level of being what I define to be a Green Amendment in the book I wrote, or as part of our For the Generations initiative, which is about getting states across the nation to pass these kinds of provisions, including in the state of Maryland. Pennsylvania's provision, while it's been in place since the early 1970s, it was only given legal life as the result of litigation brought by my organization, the Delaware Riverkeeper Network, and 7 towns, where we use the provision to overturn as unconstitutional some really devastating elements of a very pro-fracking piece of legislation. And in the course of bringing that litigation, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court actually overruled 40 plus years of jurisprudence in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania in order to give legal life to Pennsylvania's Green Amendment as part of this litigation. So the experience that we're having in Pennsylvania in the strengths and the weaknesses of a Green Amendment and how to best advance them really is only a few years old. It's as if Pennsylvania only got their Green Amendment in 2013 as a result of our litigation success. In the wake of that victory, we've been pursuing a lot of advocacy and litigation in Pennsylvania to further define what it means to have an inalienable right to clean water, clean air, and a healthy environment, and then to defend that right. But also, as part of that success, what I have been doing for the last 5 years is advancing this idea of the passage of Green Amendments in every state constitution in the nation. And so I wrote a book, The Green Amendment. We have a quite mature website called forthegenerations.org, F-O-R-T-H-E, generations.org, where you can find a lot of resources. Have been speaking across the nation, and including in Maryland, and working with communities like the folks on the phone, but most notably in Maryland, working with Nina Cardin, and because she has really been spearheading the great idea in the state of Maryland. The initiative and the work that I've been doing is about getting state-level constitutional provisions, not passing a national Green Amendment. I do not believe the time is right strategically to try to advance a national Green Amendment. In fact, I'm very opposed to that, and I put that idea down as soon as it gets raised up. I believe this is an action that has to start at the state. Since we've been advancing this Green Amendment movement, not only have we helped spark the proposal of one in the state of Maryland, but we have an active legislative proposal in New York. We have one in New Jersey. We've been working with legislators in Delaware, and again, I have been talking and working with communities in various states across the nation, all at various phases. The language really matters. I did hear some talk about, the hows and the whys of environmental justice, for example. We believe a Green Amendment is very powerful from an environmental justice perspective, but how you actually get those benefits, it's not really by the for all language, which I heard somebody mention. It really has to do with the trust language, not the public trust doctrine, but the trust language that's used in the Pennsylvania provision that we advocate for in all state provisions, because it brings with it a variety of fiduciary duties, including the duty to treat all the beneficiaries equitably. And because everybody has an individual right to a healthy environment, which is the first part of the Pennsylvania provision and the first part of any provision we'd like to see advanced, coupled with that trust language, that's really how you get to really empowering environmental justice decision-making and rights as a result of a Green Amendment. A Green Amendment, again, it's got to be properly framed. In fact, I just want you to know we had one that some folks advanced in Florida. They didn't check in with anybody, and as a result, it was a really bad idea. And so what I actually had to do was mobilize people in Florida to defeat the proposal, because if a bad proposal goes forward, whether it's successful or not, it will kill the chances of having a successful Green Amendment move forth in a state for decades. It will just derail the effort. That language up front is really critical. And so, Nina and I have been talking with Senator Zirkin about the language. There are some things that he had proposed that we have concerns with. There was some great feedback from some of the folks that Nina had brought together early on that brought up some really great points that are particularly important in the state of Maryland. So I believe that we actually do have a really good, solid straw man proposal for folks to consider early on. It doesn't mean that wouldn't be worthy of more modifications. I'm not saying that at all. It's just a good starting place for any effort that might advance in Maryland. And I and my team are available as a resource to talk about the importance of the language, and to think about changes that people might suggest, and how we could best incorporate changes to give them the greatest strength possible in a Green Amendment, or potentially discuss why it might be concerning. For example, often people want to use the term environment, and I think I saw that batted around with some folks. A healthful environment in other contexts, constitutional contexts, constitutional language in a lot of states that don't rise to that Green Amendment level. They're not in the Bill of Rights provision. and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, there are some states that have healthful environments. Language has gotten talked about. It's usually been used to really down the focus to being an environment that supports human health. And so you actually would have trouble if you were dealing with an issue where it was perhaps a species that was there. You wanted to use your Green Amendment to help in species protection, recognizing all of these, different species enrich our lives ecologically, economically, quality of life, etc. Language like healthful environment might actually limit your ability to accomplish that. So I raise that as an example, just to, as a demonstration as to why every word matters. And we do have a lot of experiences at the Delaware Riverkeeper Network with all the work that I've been doing on this initiative nationwide in the crafting of the book and the legal research that could help flag some of those possibilities, with the good ideas that might come forth for amending the straw man that we've proposed, or if people want to start with what Senator Zirkin has already proposed. But again, we have some concerns about some of that language, which we put in our public testimony. So I think I've said enough there to give you a sense of to give a sense of things, to let you know that I have a lot more to share, but I know time is tight, but I'm here as a resource and would love to be actively engaged. And the fact that I have this book, it's gotten some really great accolades and a great award very recently. So that can also help create a new pathway of sort of publicizing this idea to new audiences, because there's a book, right? And book talks and those kinds of things can, just help identify new pathways for speaking engagements to new audiences that might be helpful. So I'll leave it at that.
So I'll thank you for being a resource. The book has been incredibly helpful. Your experience and expertise will continue to be helpful. So we're really glad you're in our posse for trying to get this done in Maryland. I think I couldn't, as an environmental health organization, I will take the short version of this and say I totally understand the idea that to do this nationally would expose a really great idea to a lot of incapacity. And in the environmental justice context, that's exactly the case. It's the reason why we have maintained an executive order, despite the fact that it is not the strongest possible protection. But in this universe, it's better than not having it. So as we talked a little earlier about folks working on local ordinances that basically count as a vote of confidence for what we're pushing for in the state, it operates similarly, because to have a really strong state constitutionally bound right to access and enjoy the environment now and in the future, there is no backstop that would be stronger relative to what could or could not happen in the federal government, which is an open question when we're taking care of Maryland. So I do think that there are a lot of incredible examples. It's really thrilling to have someone with your capacity and interest and understanding of the nuance to help us along with our rules of construction to make sure we have the tightest possible language. But I'll open it up in case others want to speak to you or ask questions about what you've seen and what the barriers have been, even with a newly strengthened capacity in the state of Pennsylvania.
So seeing as there are no questions, why don't I just give you a little bit about our experience in Pennsylvania, and then people can interrupt if a question pops to your mind.
Fantastic.
Is that good? So there have been 3 cases that have gone all the way up to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court that speak directly to this issue. The first one was called Robinson Township, Delaware Riverkeeper Network v. Commonwealth. The second one was Robinson Township, Delaware, Riverkeeper Network v. Commonwealth, and it was sort of a second iteration dealing with a second set of issues. And then there's something called the Pennsylvania Environmental Defense Fund against the Commonwealth. All of these cases are on the forthegenerations.org website. And I will tell you that very first case that we got in 2013, it is so beautifully written. It was written by a very conservative Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and at the time, the Supreme Court itself was very conservative. So it's really powerful to have this very beautiful, strong language coming out of that decision. All three of those cases had to do with overreach by the state government in the fracking context. And in every instance, we had a very strong discussion of the power of the Green Amendment that Pennsylvania has that allows us to really recognize that this provision is a very strong restraint on government overreach in ways that take from people their environmental rights. But we also have a number of cases, and so each of them built on the other and has been increasingly strengthening both the individual right, but also that the trust concept that's in the Pennsylvania Green Amendment. But we've also had lower court cases that are, coming forth and dealing with issues like development in one context, a very highly contaminated site that has been long ignored by the state of Pennsylvania. And what we are seeing is that not every case has been won, but in those cases where there wasn't a victory, often it was because, as somebody did say earlier, right, the courts don't want to automatically use the constitutional lever if they can find another appropriate legislative lever to resolve the issue. And so in some cases they've done that, or it really was, frankly, the cases were well reasoned, and one could see how the lower courts got to where they got, right? But we also are having a number of cases where the lower courts are, taking very seriously this important check on our power and their responsibility to protect the environment. We are about to put up on the website sort of a summary of all of those cases. We are also, though, seeing, and it's taking time, because one of the things one has to remember in the context of Pennsylvania, right, this provision was in place for 42 years before it was given any legal strength in 2013. So regulators and legislators were given permission to ignore it for decades. Mm-hmm. So getting them to unthink that perspective is part of our work. But we are starting to see government officials in the agencies and also at the municipal level really start to recognize that they themselves have this constitutional obligation, because it does apply to every government official, and are starting to use it to engage in better decision making. We believe that Pennsylvania's Green Amendment requires not just that all communities be treated equitably, which really gets to that important environmental justice issue, but that it also, by its terms, in order to fulfill the constitutional obligation, mandates that government officials look at the specifics of a site or a community that's going to be affected by a decision that they make. What's the condition on the ground today? What would be the implications of the decision that we're about to render, or the permit that we're about to grant that will allow the construction of that new industrial operation? It absolutely requires a solid review of the science and what that means for a decision that's about to be made, because they cannot fulfill their constitutional obligation, their fiduciary obligation of prudence and loyalty, if they don't understand the science and the facts on the ground.
I can weigh in and
so
say, in Maryland,
go ahead.
We spent a lot of time working with legislators and with all of the branches to fill just that gap. We developed a document called Science for Legislators, which has helped a lot in advancing the appropriate questions to move forward. And as we're thinking about a green amendment in the state of Maryland, we're also thinking about what does it mean to have a right to community science. We don't call it citizen science because we're not that interested in making people feel left out based on their legal status. But what does it mean to be able to have local data at your fingertips that could even be translated to someone who has a right to answer, to be able to be responsible for it? We're also looking at a health impact assessment, which is just that question that you seized on about what does it mean? You can look at the air and the water and you can even gather the soil, but unless you connect that to an explicit decision to consider the human health impacts, you're missing a part of the conversation that allows it to be viable. And so this is really encouraging to hear that the lines of logic are matching up across state lines.
Actually, Tamara.
Totally matches up with what you're saying. Mm-hmm.
I want to just add one other thing that I understand is happening in Pennsylvania. There's an assumption that since the state is the trustee, and one of the things the trustees are responsible for is reporting back to those folks for whom they are holding this property in trust. So therefore, the trustees, therefore the state, would have to issue regular reports on the status of the environment, on the status of the soil and the air and the water and the impact on human health, so that we could, at building this legislative record, we could say that we assume that part of the outcome of passing such an amendment would be these regular reports. And therefore, tomorrow, the sort of the community scientists and the folks who would want to contribute to these reports would also be part of that process. So it really is coming full circle to helping people who are being protected contribute to the powers that would protect them.
Yes, and that's important because we think about community health isn't just what's happening inside the doctor's office. It's about your feeling that you have some agency over your life. And if you are not participating in the solutions and are having problems piled on you, that's another health issue that you're facing.
And one of the things that I believe too, right, is, people, we have to remember that through the passage of a green amendment today means that we're going to be engaged in not just the crafting of the language, but the creating of the legislative history that's going to go with that language, that future justices and or legislators are going to turn to in determining how to interpret the green amendment. So that's something that I think is really powerful. Often people fret, well, will the courts get it right? Well, we're not going to be looking to an amendment that was passed 200 years ago, and boy, what does it mean in modern times? We're going to be looking at a green amendment where we not only crafted the amendment language, but the legislative history, and made very, very clear through the advocacy and the organizing and the demand for this great green amendment what it means and what our expectations are of legislators. And we're going to be making sure that people start using, or I would hope, start using this green amendment and our work towards it in the political arena, and that every time there's a debate for candidates running for office, they're going to be asked questions about their stance on the people's right to pure water, clean air, and a healthy environment, or whatever language we end up using, and they're going to be expected to answer those questions. And so I think one of the other dynamics of a modern day movement to pass the Green Amendment is we start necessarily electing to office people who are environmentally minded, who appreciate and recognize the power and importance of a healthy environment for healthy lives and healthy people. And so I think that we all also then start changing that political dynamic that is going to be such a powerful complement to an outgrowth of this Green Amendment effort.
Fantastic. This is an incredible conversation, and I feel like it's a really good start to our discussion of what it's going to look like to develop a useful tool for making this happen. And I cannot thank you enough, Maya and Nina and Betsy and everyone else who's on the call. You won't be able to see this, Maya, because you are on the phone, but the slide that's up right now is the email address for Further Generations and a description of it. so that folks recognize that it's a continuing resource as we delve into these conversations. And we hope to have you in a great state of Maryland to be able to talk about this more specifically. And the handouts will be posted. We'll send out a link at the end of this that summarizes everything and that has the presentation. The next slide is a set of resources on the community conversation around what happened in Pennsylvania, around what happened in Montana, and about just the lots of different resources that have popped up. And we have a couple of pages of resources that'll be great for folks to dig into around what's happening at the state level and what we want to see happen in Maryland. And I will just open it up in case there are any other last questions before just wrapping up our conversation for today. Well, hearing none, I'll just let you know that our next briefing will happen on September 24th at noon, and the topic will be renewable energy standards in Maryland, which will dovetail really nicely into this first conversation. And I am looking forward to us setting up a discussion in even greater detail of how this could feed into that amongst the other amongst all the other competing ideas. If we don't have a ceiling, it's very difficult to know where we are trying to go. So this conversation around renewable energy standards that will follow community solar, that will follow health impact assessments and natural gas infrastructure, every part of that will refer back to what would happen if our backstop was a green amendment. So I thank you all for joining, and I hope to see you on noon on the 24th, where we'll have Chesapeake Climate Action and IEER's own Arjun Makajani talking about what's happening in renewable energy in Maryland. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Have a great day.